Welcome everybody. This is the first of a series of lectures in preparation for a neural network architecture seminar we are going to be enjoying here in the Towards AI Discord server. And we can start with some acknowledgements. I would like to thank you all for attending the seminar and hopefully to present later on. This is a redux of a seminar I taught in last year in Córdoba National University in Argentina. And I'd like to thank Dr. Barsotti, that was also the co-host of the Argentina seminar. Of course, Luis Bouchard from Towards AI for all the enthusiasm and support to encourage him to have the seminar on the server. And Towards AI for allowing to host it, and of course the other moderators at Towards AI. I am personally located in Vancouver, BC, in the NCC territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Wanuth nations, and I'd like to thank them for having care for the land. So, this seminar has 9 concept level lectures presenting the most commonly used architectures. It's like a summary background of the field. It covers a little bit more than 50 papers, and the intention is to try to, in a way, is to get out of the technical hamster wheel. Like, technology is, in neural networks, is so complex that we really get taken away by the technical details. And the intention is to take a little more abstract view and to really focus on the architecture itself. And also, well, of course, to help the people presenting on the seminar to establish common background. It's also very common that people come from different directions and backgrounds, and then communication is complex. And one of the nice things about having these introductory lectures is that then there is no need to explain UNets and transformers in every presentation. But of course, the seminar itself will cover more recent versions of the architectures presented. So the 9 lectures I'm going to go through today, giving an idea what we were going to see in each of these lectures, particularly if people want to just come to a few of them to decide which ones they want to, they will find it more informative. The next lecture is going to be on what I call popular architectures, some things that are quite useful as architectures for people to try and use, particularly multitask learning, CMEs networks, which are very useful for learning metrics, generative adversarial networks, in particular useful for style transfer, and disentangled representation learning. The third lecture, we're going to see structured learning networks. Some very, very old networks like Hochfeld networks, RBMs, the SOM. Then we're going to see autoencoders, variational autoencoders, and wrap up disentangled representations. In the fourth lecture, we're going to see convolutional networks, so CNNs, deep learning for image processing, YOLO, RepilaNet, and UNet and SpyNet. Something I would like to mention is that we are not going to see YOLO version 7 or one of the recent ones, but we're going to see the original YOLO paper. And the intention here is, again, to build a common background. And of course, if people want to present some of the latest incarnation of YOLO, then that would be a fantastic presentation for the seminar. In lecture 5, we're going to see recurrent neural networks, training by unrolling, internal memory access, updates, LSTMs, GRUs, encoder-decoder, and attention in encoder-decoder systems. That will give us a sedge into lecture 6, when we're going to see transformer networks, starting with the Attention is All You Need paper, transformers, BERT, GPT, T5, pre-training, transfer learning, zero-shot, and few-shot learning. Lecture 7, we are going to see graph processing networks, the issue of local versus global, GNNs, DGCNNs, graph convolutional networks, and neural message passing. Lecture 8 is personally one of my favorite lectures. We are going to see multimedia processing architectures, visual question answering, neural module networks, hierarchical coattention, and then the techniques used by DALI and stable diffusion. And the last lecture, we are going to see neural architecture search, particularly the neat paper of neural evolution using genetic algorithms, the network distillation techniques, and some techniques for that use gradients over network architectures. So as you can see, these are going to see, we are going to have quite a variety of topics the following weeks. Today, this is going to be a very brief lecture where we're going to do a little bit of a neural networks review. So, what is deep learning, neuron types, feedforward networks, backpropagation, and then I'm going to discuss very briefly about the different deep learning frameworks as how they pertain to architectures. Now, the question is, why study neural network architectures? Yes, in the sense of, do we need to study neural network architectures? We could just say, I'm going to use this particular technique, and it comes with a neural architecture inside, and there is no need to go further. Yeah, well, neural network architecture is a great place to start the decision about what type of solution we are going to do in our own projects. Moreover, many times the architectures that exist are not enough for our needs, so then we might need to build our own architecture. And the part that interests me in particular is the neural network architecture synthesize features, representations in the different layers. And because I'm interested in feature engineering, even done by hand, then this allows us to understand a little more deeply what type of processing is happening within the neural net and what type of features we are obtaining. This is, of course, a very long-term goal. We are, for some architectures and some networks, we do know how they synthesize features. For others, they are still quite opaque. And in a way, well, this is what I would like us to discuss more on the seminars, or what would think about these feature representations, how this network is actually behaving and moving forward. And part of this seminar is to look at what problems exist in neural network architectures. By far, one of the main issues in neural network architectures is that they take input from many sources. So something we will see is that people working in a particular problem discover that a certain neural network structure or subnetwork or layer or neuron or general specific items are applicable to that problem. And then slowly people in other sub-problems give it a try and start expanding the generality and usefulness of the technique to other sub-problems. The issue is that then this original solution that comes from, I don't know, quantum chemistry starts being used in natural language processing. But the original concept really makes sense coming from quantum chemistry. So the notation, the whole spirit of the solution is quite embedded into the domain where it came. And that makes it hard to understand it, and because you have to have at least some intuitions about why this came about. Something also that is quite problematic in neural network architectures is that certain architectures work, but then the variations do not work. And that can be very counterintuitive. It's like, why if I have more neurons here or less neurons here, then the system just doesn't converge, or it produces suboptimal results. So there is a trade-off between the capacity of the architecture and the generalization power. And we're going to see some examples in today's lecture. Overall, the evolution, as a field in neural network architectures, is quite driven for we found something that works, and we just use it. And then over time, we start building understanding about why it works. Yes, but that takes time, and it's quite a posteriori. Yeah. And what happens is that the neural architecture encodes inductive biases, encodes the way that a particular problem will be better solved. Yeah, and that's what makes the neural network architecture successful at addressing that problem, because there is a match between the inductive bias that the network represents and the type of characteristics of the problem. So these type of things get better and better understood by the whole community after the fact and over time. And that's quite problematic. We have some new architectures that are very exciting, and we don't quite know why they work. And something that is a big problem in AI is, and in science, in many other disciplines in science, is that there is a lack of communication, scientific and technical communications, for negative results. So we know which architectures work well, but we might not know which ones do not. All right, so artificial neural networks are a graph of processing units that receive the appropriate name of neurons. And these processing networks take input data or downstream neuron and pipes that data into each of these processing units that aggregate these inputs, normally through summation, and pass this aggregation into an activation function that computes the neuron output. Yeah? And the output of each of these units is then piped into upstream neurons. Neurons are normally grouped into layers, and such that the neurons in a particular layer are connected to the next layer. And how layers are arranged and connected defines the topology or architecture of the network. So in the objective of this seminar then is to study this type of topology. And part of the issues with topology is what type of neurons are out there. Most neurons sum its input after multiplying them by weights and then applying a nonlinear function to it. That's called the activation function. And so the neurons are normally recognized by the type of activation function they use. Examples include the sigmoid function or the hyperbolic tangent. And usually neurons also include a bias, an additional input that is hardwired to 1 and receive its own weight. If the neuron doesn't have a bias, then it cannot learn to produce a non-zero output when all its inputs are zeros. Some architecture also include loops, what's called recurrence, and that requires special training techniques. So this figure comes from the book that was cited at the beginning, the Neural Network Design book. That's a book that is a little old by now. It's almost 10 years old from the latest edition, but it's free online, and it does a very good job describing really old architectures, which is not as bad as it sounds, because many of the architectures that are very popular these days come from the 90s, yes. So sometimes reading about this old material can help us have ideas about new things we can do today with the computing power we have today. So here you have what is called a feedforward network in layers that receive inputs from the previous layer and go computing. And the interesting thing about this description is that we can see this telescopic behavior, how the activation function gets applied like an onion to the inputs of earlier layers. And to go back to what I was mentioning about how the neural network, there is a trade-off between the capacity of the network and its architecture. We have here a simple function from this neural network design. This is a sine wave with 3 waves there. And if we have a neural network with 2 neurons in the middle layer, then it can only get one of the waves of the sine. If you have 3, then you get 2 of the waves. You have 4, you get 2, and if you have 5, then it can get it completely. However, that doesn't mean that just having more neurons is all what you need. We all know about overfitting, and overfitting is neural network architecture is a very key place where overfitting happens. In this case, we have this simple curve, but because we have given too much parameters to the system, then it's start getting this type of waves that are not part of the curve, but come from making too many assumptions about the data, having too many free parameters. So to train these, we use backpropagation. Yeah. So if we want to know how the system is behaving, we can compute the error, just the difference between the expected output and the output we get. However, training the error using the errors directly is not a good idea, because we want to quantify the importance of the errors for particular tasks we are doing. So instead of using errors, we use the errors to define a loss function. And there are a number of loss functions that are used in practice, like the mean square error or the cross entropy, etc. So to define the problem of neural network architectures, we need to define the way the neurons are connected, the way the type of activation functions we use on the neurons, and also the loss function that is being used. So in a feedforward network, then we take we change the weights, we change the parameters of the network using the gradient of the loss function with respect to the gradient with respect to the weight and biases. We calculate them in layer by layer in reverse order using the chain rule, and then we can modify the weights based on the contribution to the change on the loss function. And this can be trained using stochastic gradient descent, given that the function that the network expresses is differentiable. And also, we can fix that certain weights in the network always receive the same updates. That in turn leads to these weights to be conceptually like shared weights, because they always have the same value, which is also a very important architectural decision, whether some weights are independent or they are fixed to the same value. So, as I was mentioning, from the perspective of neural network architectures, the architecture is defined as the type of neurons and how they are connected, which at the end of the day boils down to a set of formulas that describe the relationship between inputs and outputs. To train the parameter of the network, the weight and biases, we need a loss function, and the loss function applied to this formula that expresses the whole network has to be differentiable against the parameters. While it's my interest is to study the architectures at a more abstract manner, the practical matters are still important. Yes, there should be enough training data for being able to train all these neural network parameters, and the network should work well with existing hardware. In the papers we are going to see, there's a lot of discussion about how to make the network fit within the memory of existing GPUs and split it into, or at least split it into multiple GPUs. Okay, so that's neural networks in general. Then we have the concept of deep learning, which is a series of techniques that enable the training of neural networks with multiple hidden layers using backpropagation. And this is achieved through the use of better activation functions like the rectifier linear units, better initialization of weights, better training scheduling like mini batches, and better objective functions like softmax. So in the early work on neural networks, we use a sigmoid function, which is quite computationally expensive to compute. With the advent of deep learning, it is quite common now to use ReLUs or liquid ReLUs or any of their variations, which are faster to run in a GPU and also end up being better behaved in a number of problems. Something that was quite a breakthrough for neural nets when it was discovered is the issue that weight initialization before deep learning was assigning too much variability to the weights, which in turn means that the initialization procedure was dominating the training results. So there was a need to train the network multiple times because many of the times the network just didn't converge in the training. So instead, with deep learning initialization techniques, we can use the variability of the network, and now we can train them in a more consistent manner. And then we have, of course, softmax layers that allow to compute, to train a system that tries to set only one network, one unit in the output layer to the maximum value, and the rest as close to zero as possible. We have mini batches that perform weight updates over a small number of training instances. This started as a practical need for using GPUs, but in reality it also helps regarding overfitting and getting stuck in local minima. We have dropout, that is improved generalization by ignoring a percentage of the neurons during training. We have batch normalization layers, skip connections, and tension, and many other things that we will see in different lectures at the time architectures that use them are presented. So all this should be familiar to people taking this seminar, but just wanted to establish a common background. And now I'm going to wrap up discussing a little bit about deep learning frameworks and architectures. Architectures go hand in hand with the frameworks and the GPUs used to train them. In general, the frameworks divide into two types: train and run, and train by run. In the train and run, you define the whole architecture first, and then you train them. And examples include Theano, the first version of TensorFlow, and JAX. Alternatively, you can train by running. Yes, so you don't require to explicitly define the architecture. The program itself defines the architecture. And the main examples are PyTorch and TensorFlow 2.0. And we're going to now see them a little bit. So key to this framework is the concept of automatic differentiation. Yeah. So from the discussion on stochastic gradient descent, it is clear that calculating gradients of complex formulas is key to train a complex architecture. So in the train and run model, we define the whole architecture, and then we can compute these gradients symbolically. However, if you compute things symbolically, you are going to run into the problem that this is inefficient because the formulas get duplicated between different subtrees. So it requires quite a bit of intelligence on the symbolic computation to be efficient. And also, making control structures is very hard. Control structure like loops or ifs, things like that. Instead, of late, most systems have converged to automatic differentiation, where we take a second-order Taylor series approximation, and we replace all our numeric computations with pairs of numbers using this Taylor series approximation. These are called dual numbers. So then the system executes over these approximations, and this allows the direct calculation of the gradient. But it requires a runtime that can handle dual numbers, or a compiler that can take a program and generate machine code for them. So PyTorch and TensorFlow 2.0, all of them do this type of thing under the hood. And then we also need to have some understanding about the computational architecture of GPUs, because they produce constraints, particularly for large architectures. Issues regarding the locality of the data, the maximum data size for parameter tables, the type of control structures they can take, like branching and similar things, branch predictions, and then the ability to decide what sections we want to run on the CPU and which ones we want to ship to GPUs. So the first deep learning framework was Theano. It was developed at Université d'École Polytechnique in Montreal. It's the original train and run framework. So it uses symbolic derivatives with an automatic simplification of the computational graph. And originally, Keras was an independent project that allowed you to choose between Theano and TensorFlow 1.0. While the project was an academic project, didn't have enough manpower to stay up to date, still the automatic differentiation lives on as the ISARA project. Then we have TensorFlow. TensorFlow uses automatic differentiation. TensorFlow 1.0 was a train and run framework that was language independent. TensorFlow 2.0, on the other hand, is a train by run framework and is heavily embedded in Python. And has a heavy use in the industry. However, some of the decisions within TensorFlow seem a little arbitrary to people outside Google. So it's a little bit of a love and hate framework of sorts. Then we have Torch. Torch, the original, I have never been much involved with Torch or PyTorch. For preparing these lectures, I read the original paper, the 2011 paper, and I think I started understanding it a little better through that. So the original framework was tied to Lua, and that framework, the one described in 2011 paper, was discontinued in 2018. But one of the interesting things about the framework is that it's inspired in MATLAB. So it's a really computation-oriented framework. Currently, the framework that's still heavy use is PyTorch, that is embedded into Python, and is quite used in research because it has a very fine level control of what is happening, particularly the explicit calculation of the gradients. And finally, we have JAX. This is a relatively newer system. JAX, its claim to fame is that it allows you to use many GPUs in a transparent manner. And that's thanks to a concept of immutability on the data. So what it does is it's considered everything you do produces a new array, a new copy of the data, and then this is made efficient by using a copy on writes. So you do all these changes that produce conceptually new copies of the data, but that copy it doesn't materialize until needed. And this is called a lazy evaluation, yes, and well, it's also heavily on automatic differentiation. So in general, because this is the only actively in use surviving train and run framework, these things have a much higher barrier of entry to use, because you have to design your whole system and then run it. Yes, so when you run it, if it fails, you have to go back to your definition, and that's that gap can be quite big. I remember in Theano, for example, it was debugging it wasn't easy, which is a little bit why both TensorFlow 2.0 and PyTorch are more eager evaluation and train by run. Okay, so to wrap up today, complex architectures, well, achieve complex feature representations, but they also need a lot of data. We will see in other lectures that transfer learning can alleviate some of those needs when it's available, when you can have some general models that can be pre-trained on a lot of data. On the other hand, if you don't have enough data available, then you have to resort to simpler systems like statistical machine learning and use hand-built feature engineering, which is a topic I know quite a bit, and I even wrote a book. So in a way, my interest on the architectures is coming from feature engineering by hand. The other thing is, well, at 50-something papers for this seminar, you can imagine I do actually read a lot of papers. And after a certain amount of papers, you start really, you kind of read them and then you forget them. So I have spent some time developing my own open source project to help remember the papers I read. And well, I invite you to check it out. It's on GitHub. It allows you to manage bibliography within Jupyter Notebooks. It's a BibTeX plus MindMap. And in comparison to other projects like Zotero and the like, this has a mind map, so you can actually relate papers one to another. And it includes full text indexing and query by example. So you can say, I have this draft and I want to find related papers on my paper database and things like that. And well, that concludes the recording part, and we can now pass to discussion and get to know each other a little bit. Thank you so much for joining.